Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight to the launch of this briefing paper on the Afghan Taliban after a decade of war. I'm very delighted to have with us three wonderful speakers and the two authors of the paper. The two authors are Theo Farrell and Michael Semple. Theo is Dean of Arts and Social Sciences at City University of London and Associate Fellow with us here at RUSI. And Michael is visiting research professor at the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation and Social Justice at Queen's University Belfast. This paper is the continuation of a set of conversations that they started in 2012. I believe it's the third conversation, and it's based on 7 interviews with key informants with very well-connected Talibans. The aim of the paper is to discuss the new Taliban leadership as well as the future of the peace talks. Tonight with us, we also have Sir Simon Gass. He is at the moment at the Commonwealth Secretariat as acting Chief Operating Officer. Previously, he was political director at the FCO, as well as the Prime Minister's Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, among other things. Because we don't have more than 1 hour, and I know that there is a room packed with experts on Afghanistan, I would promptly ask the two speakers to provide 5 to 7 minutes introductory remark on the paper, and then I will ask Simon to briefly provide his insight on the paper. Michael, when you want, the floor is yours.
First mover's disadvantage. Hello, everyone. I mean, we're great. That's why I love it. Yeah, in fact, that's a really good interruption because it's difficult to say anything on international issues, without wondering what's going on in the United States. So it's only appropriate that the heckler should be from the United States. That's really good. Disruptive influence. Good. Got it. You are a true patriot. But seriously, as we sort of try to focus on this particular issue, while there's a demo going on across the road, of course. We're trying to work out what happens in this very costly conflict, which has ramifications across the world, of course. I mean, people here and actors in Afghanistan are trying to guess what's happening in the US and what will be the American position. And, we've all got our opinions and expectations, but there's certainly no certainty. And that makes it indeed quite difficult to plan for the future. But we the study which this is drawn from actually took place while the election was happening. I mean, literally, I went out for a run in between our conversations, and things were going one direction, and by the time I got back from a reasonably long run, we knew which way the world was going to be going. So anyway, this was a conversation with a small number of Taliban, but we were confident that there are people who connect into enough parts of the movement that they were able to give a good grounding of what's happening, what Taliban are thinking. So I think we could, look, this is not a quantitative study, but this is something that we were confident from the quality of the conversations and that the nature of the comment that they were able to give, that they were able to reflect what was happening inside the Taliban. And if I were to summarize what we did in this work, we focused on the neglected variable of the insurgency, which is Taliban politics. Because Taliban politics is the variable that in a sense so many people don't want to talk about. For starters, Taliban officials would say, hey, we're a united movement with one great leader who's leading us in the path of Sharia towards victory. They don't want to talk about internal politics because for them it's taboo. It doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. Too often I found when talking with esteemed colleagues from the Kabul government, when they want to explain what's going on in the Taliban and why the Taliban do things or don't do certain things, they'd far rather talk about the ISI. They'd rather blame it on Pakistan rather than talk about an internal Taliban process. So in a sense, one runs a risk that when by focusing on Taliban politics, it's almost as if you're distracting about the real picture, which is what the evil ISI are doing. From some parts of a Kabul perspective. And the internationals, well, sometimes one feels when dealing with international actors, it's inaccessible. We didn't really think it was important, and we've had American colleagues who've said, "Oh, we never really thought about the Taliban politically before." So, we focused on Taliban politics, and before I hand over to Theo, apart from just saying, look, Taliban politics, they're there. There's, we could talk all night, but we're not allowed to. There's lots happening. One particular thing which we took note of was the state of the leadership. We found that the current leader no longer has the kind of magic touch that Mullah Umar had. That's gone. And if, as remarkably, many of the interlocutors talked in terms of the Taliban movement no longer continuing in its current shape for much longer. If there are profound developments, splits, falling apart, implosions, if by any chance these things happen, a key factor will be the crisis in the leadership. Because the Taliban, until now, the whole dynamic has been around obedience to the leader, and that's given you this cohesive national movement. The current leader came out time and time again, has been unable to stamp his authority on different factions inside the movement. He's been unable to practice the kind of patronage politics which is key inside Afghanistan. He hasn't got a grip on the resources in the way that his predecessor, particularly after Mohammed Mansour, had. He is considered as no longer an effective leader. And that is, if there was one thing that one had to understand from Taliban politics and then go say, okay, what are the implications? This would be it. Theo.
Okay, thanks, Michael. It's interesting. The thing that really struck me from the interviews, as somebody who studied the war, my piece is the war itself. That's what I work on. And when you look at what's happened the last 2 years since the end of the ISAF campaign, it's spectacular gains by the Taliban on the battlefield. I mean, really impressive, and achieving one of their key objectives, which was to capture a provincial capital, which they did twice. In September 2015 and again in October 2016. Kunduz, they did it twice. Almost overrunning Lashkar in May 2016. I mean, almost completely overrunning Lashkar. And so much of the country now out of the control of the government. 66% of the 407 districts in the country. You think Taliban morale must be sky high, and the propaganda says this. Our morale is very, very high. And yet all the interviewers were talking about problems with Taliban morale, and that was really, really striking. And hence, what we say in this paper, we reach a very kind of conservative assessment, because we obviously have to allow for the fact that whilst the people we spoke with represent large swathes of the Taliban, of course there are many parts of the Taliban still committed to the fight. But our assessment was that actually morale within the Taliban is at best varied. The kind of things that the people we were interviewing were talking about were, well, the gains that have been made in Farrell and Fayyab, the heavy fighting there in the Uruzgan and Helmand, had come at very great cost. And there's a sense that there's limited utility in this military sacrifices, because they can overrun a provincial capital, but they can't hold it. They'll get pushed out by the army. And the same is true of many of the district centres. And there's also, combined with this sense that they have no confidence in their leadership. So when you take both what Michael's been saying, which is the sense that the head of the Taliban is really just a symbol, and the leadership is no longer effective. Well, they're in the middle of a war being led by leadership which they no longer have confidence in. And so when you think about the fact that the Taliban have been engaged now in this war for really about a decade, they don't see victory anywhere in sight. And there's this growing distaste we found with this sense that some parts of the Taliban, and certain people we spoke with, there's a growing distaste towards un-Islamic motivations and behaviour by many military commanders. this sense that Taliban restrictions on killing civilians and destroying civilian structures now are just widely ignored. And many of the people we interviewed spoke about senior military commanders engaged in a competition between each other in the use of martyrdom attacks. And so there was an overall sense that possibly the movement was being corrupted by a military campaign that had lost direction. And there's no doubts that you have this unmistakable cumulative disaffection by large swathes of the Taliban with the armed campaign. And the final point I just make before handing back to Michael is you also have to, on top of this, what's also impacting on Taliban morale were the recent clampdowns in Pakistan towards the Taliban, both in terms of arrests of senior Taliban figures, but also in various measures designed just to make life more difficult for Afghans living in Pakistan. And so several of the interviewees talked about these moves to oust refugees as going to cause a quote-unquote humanitarian calamity. And they're obviously very alarmed. Now, since then, the reports suggest that the Pakistan government has reined back on this. But it all adds to this growing sense of insecurity. The leadership is going nowhere. There's no strong leadership. The war is going nowhere. It's just dragging on. And now the sanctuaries in Pakistan in the long term are open to question.
So, where does this leave us? We came up with an idea and decided to float a concept based on this idea that there's a very lively Taliban politics there. Given what's going on around us, even out there, think of a movement whose even if there's one particular leader who's only been there for the past 8 months, but there's like a leadership cadre which has been there forever, and they seem to be sort of pursuing their own interests rather than anything to do with the common good. They seem to be ready to forsake the values and essential purpose of the movement, and they're prepared to throw the base under the bus. Now, I mean, to some extent, that's a narrative which is familiar from across the Atlantic. And so we threw up the idea of insurgent peacemaking, the insurgency inside the insurgency. That the Taliban that we talked with and the Taliban that they described are people who've reached the conclusion that this war is no longer worth fighting. There's no longer moral purpose in shedding Afghan blood. But an establishment still controls the movement, and it's the establishment which has monopolized contacts in anything which have had the potential to be a peace process over the past few years. I spent several years back and forth to the National Security Council and the US, and that they were, they're always interested in what I had to say. But look, they found one address, which was the Taliban Political Commission in Qatar, and look, this is what we're backing. That was the establishment. For a year, we had Ashraf Ghani, partly in, it was a big strategic idea. He was and he had this idea of this, we can get the ISI to do the right thing. It was basically use the ISI to engage with the Taliban leadership and drive a process. The establishment in the Taliban decided that was not going to go anywhere. It didn't happen. So if you think of insurgent peacemaking, it would be an approach to the peace process which is different from the way things have gone before, which have focused on having a single official address for engagement. And insurgent peacemaking would be peacemaking which found a way to engage in dialogue and ultimately to empower and ensure that they are actors in the peace process, those parts of the Taliban movement who have reached the conclusion that now is the time for a settlement. There are many different ways in which one could envisage operationalizing this, but to start with, you have to start with this analytical leap. That recognize that there's Taliban politics, and because there's Taliban politics, a peace process must not be monopolized by a leadership which is trying to cling on to power and has taken a decision that the armed struggle must continue come what may. It would be a process which have multiple addresses, and those addresses are Taliban who actually are ready to seek an early settlement with fellow Afghans.
Thank you very much. Simon, if you want to...
Well, thank you, and I'll keep it brief, not least because Michael and Theo are the real experts here, but I will try and just add a little bit of... I'll start off with just perhaps a little bit of historical perspective just from my experience of... when I think back to the time when I was based in Kabul in 2011, 2012, so we were looking forwards to the end of 2014, trying to work out what it might look like. And I think we asked ourselves... three questions about the post-2014 Taliban. And the three questions were, firstly, what would it feel like to be part of this insurgency when there were no longer any foreigners to fight? When you were no longer trying to blow up Americans or British or others, but when essentially you were engaging with your fellow countrymen and co-religionists, of course, critically. And we thought that could be difficult. Secondly, what would it feel like to be part of the Taliban when there was no Karzai? Karzai, who had absolutely been reviled and identified as a US stooge. I can't say that it actually felt like that when you were dealing with Karzai, but anyway, that's what the Taliban said. And so you had a new president who'd been elected in an Afghan election, and you were past that sense of, no, we can't possibly deal with the president of Afghanistan. And thirdly, and I still think this is very important, what does your narrative become as a leader in the leadership shura when you've been through a fighting season against the ANSF? The ANSF has stood up and fought. In fact, we've been through two now. And you had told your people again and again, don't worry, when the Americans leave, we'll be going home because that's when we win. And all of a sudden it appears perhaps it isn't quite that simple anymore. And you no longer have that very clear narrative about how there's a happy end to all of this from the Taliban perspective. Now, it feels to me as though some of what Michael and Theo are talking about is partially an answer to that. Of course, there's one big factor which they have mentioned, which we did not calculate on, partly because I don't think anybody really knew what the truth was then, which was the Mullah Omar factor and the way in which that acted as a unifying force on the Taliban. But I do think that we're now into that space where some of these questions are beginning to become a bit more answerable. And in a sense, what I understand Michael and Theo to be talking about is a new take on an old question, which is, if we want to deal with the Taliban, are we best to deal with them in a single block, or are we best to deal with individual factions? And question, should we even be trying to encourage that divisiveness within the Taliban in the expectation or hope that you might be able to split some groups off? I realise that's not quite what Michael is talking about, but it's a sort of adjacent question. Is it better to try to capture the Taliban, bring them in whole, or do you end up having to bring in part of them? And I think that what Michael is talking about is very powerful, the question of whether you can bring in groups of insurgents under individual leaders and bring them into a peace process in a way which at one stage the reintegration programme, of course, was partly thought to have that potential, and although I'm not absolutely up to speed with it, certainly when I lost contact with it, it wasn't really managing to do that for a variety of reasons. So I think there is certainly potential in this idea. I think if I had to pose some questions, and Michael and Theo will be well ahead of me in terms of what the answers to, it's always seemed to me that one of the difficulties with trying to deal with the Taliban in groups is the problem of they may talk, but in the past, being one Taliban leader or a few Taliban leaders who were prepared to talk about peace has not been a fantastically career-enhancing move for them, and quite often not even a health or liberty-enhancing move for them. So how do you get over this leap by which you can actually persuade them that there is a viable option for coming in from the cold without finding themselves in an extraordinarily difficult and dangerous position? And I'll be really interested to hear about how that could work. I think there is also, for me, I realise I'm going a little bit off track here, there is a bigger question which there may by now be an answer to, but if there is, I'm not sure what it is, which is what is the model for integrating the Taliban, for reintegrating the Taliban, particularly into southern Afghan political, commercial, and dare I say it, probably criminal life. I mean, who makes space for the Taliban to come back in from where they are at the moment and gives them a status, a position, a political influence? That seems to me to be quite a difficult challenge. It's not one that I've ever yet heard satisfactorily answered, but even if you bring in groups of Taliban, you are going to have to find a way in which these people can earn their livings, they can hold on to resources which they have, and in which they are going to feel safe, and that seems to me to be quite a difficult challenge. So I think it's a fascinating paper. I think this could well be a way in which the peace process could move forward. I mean, heaven knows we have to try everything, but one, like everything to do with a peace process, and particularly in Afghanistan, one that is not without a good many challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. So we have about 40 minutes, and I know a lot of you have questions at this point. I will ask you to raise your hand and introduce yourself, and you are free to ask questions to any of the speakers here. Before starting, though, I would want to ask one question myself, using the prerogative of a chair. I was wondering if in your interviews, the role of the regional players, regional actors, emerge in any way with regard to weakening or strengthening the various factions of the Taliban. You mentioned briefly Pakistan, but Iran and the Mansour network. I was wondering if this is something that came up in the interviews, and how would that affect the insurgent peacemaking, if in any way?
Do you want me to have a go?
I mean, it's a very straightforward answer, which is several of the interviewees did refer to parts of the Taliban receiving support from Iran and Russia. There were particular claims made around particular pieces of military equipment that were provided, as well as financial assistance, and in particular to the Mansour network. But of course, one doesn't know for sure how much credence you can give this. And in a nice line in the paper that actually Michael put in, there's a kind of tradition of this kind of thing going on way back, where Afghans claim support. But there's no doubt there's lots of reports of Iran providing support to parts of the Taliban. There's nothing new there. The question is the extent to which perhaps they are providing support to the Mansour network, and the extent, if it is true, the extent to which this somehow enables the Mansour network to be less dependent on, or should we say, put pressure on by the Pakistanis. But as we report in the paper, both the Pakistan government and the Afghan government have been putting pressure on the Ishqazai, and part of that is about trying to put pressure on the Mansour network. I mean, so to get to Simon's point, as we argued in our paper, the sort of health and other risks to Taliban who might come forward to support a peace process are perhaps less from the leadership, as we argue, because the leadership is so ineffective. But actually, in fairness, what we don't really deal with in the paper, and Michael may have a view, is the extent to which Pakistan is still able to block peace processes it doesn't want to see go forward. And that seems to be potentially more of a problem.
Michael, did you want to?
Yeah. Okay. Just to add briefly first,
Yeah.
I think that if you're thinking about in august locations like this in 1838 and 1839, gentlemen, mainly gentlemen, were trying to make a call on and how seriously the Russians were then engaged in Kabul. I think a lot of people have since concluded they called it wrong. They allowed Afghan exaggeration of the extent of the Afghan engagement with the Russians then to push Britain and British India into unnecessary actions, and we're sort of living with the consequences. So let's learn. There is a tendency of Afghan actors, and it has become part of the political culture to do politics by invoking the regional powers that are supposedly backing you. And I think that so far the Russians and Iranians are happy to be talked up a bit, but haven't shown sign of a really strategic level of commitment to getting into bed with the Taliban, which would render it impossible to proceed with the kind of insurgent peacemaking that we're talking about here. But then, on given that the actor which I think pretty much any serious scholarship would acknowledge as the most decisive regional actor still is of course Pakistan. They clearly still engage with the Taliban, still have what looks like more than one strategy running simultaneously, or a strategy which has got multiple strands, seemingly competitive. Some stuff to pressurize the Taliban, and some stuff to patronize the Taliban. And my understanding of the most sensible way to approach this is to learn from Ashraf Ghani's experience of the past year, which was he basically put the Pakistanis on the critical path. Without serious Pakistan positive engagement, his process wasn't going to go anywhere, and it didn't. It got stopped. So I think the point is that the point of this insurgent peacemaking is that it shouldn't depend for every first move on the Pakistanis doing something. And then I'm sure that I know that colleagues in the Afghan government are then working hard. Okay, at least how can we try and control their spoiling activity? So one thing is you expect that there will be some spoiling activity, but at least don't basically give them a monopoly of whether the thing goes forward or not, which is essentially what was done diplomatically over the past year.
Excellent, thank you. So there was a question here, sir.
The Taliban.
Please introduce yourself first.
Oh, sorry.
No worries.
My name is Mehrab Sergio from Balochistan. I'm a blogger and researcher. Taliban always never been unified force. From that, when they were in government, they were what they call it, the Amarat Afghanistan. They divided Afghanistan between emirs. And now the Taliban is still they're not unified force. As when for 2 years, the Mullah Omar was dead, and then the foreign agencies run the Taliban on his name, and that's the man who leaked his death, he was Akhtar Mansour, and the Taliban son hated Akhtar Mansour, and what is happened to him. But without you tackling the Mashhad, Zahedan, Quetta, and Lahore, Rawan control the Taliban mind. Rawan control Taliban mind, and this control the movement. It's ideology from the Rawan, not those people on the mountain. To replace them is like that. They just one. Sorry to say, one donkey goes, other donkey carry the load. That is the mentality for the agencies who control the Taliban.
I mean,
sorry, if I can group 3 questions together, so you can. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, although this is a pretty big question, and this is going to be bigger.
Here is also from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thanks very much for interesting presentations. Look forward to reading the paper. I wondered if I could invite you to sort of elaborate a little bit on the objectives and operational implications of this notion of insurgent peacemaking. Would one be seeking to sort of empower these voices within still one movement, or a relatively control, or is it to attempt to break away pieces to make separate deals with those. And sort of on the back, if it's the latter particularly, I would caution against writing off the establishment of the Taliban too soon, as it were. You said yourself, Michael, that it was the establishment that set itself against Ghani's sort of path via Islamabad, and that was an important reason why it didn't succeed. So what is it you're looking for, the establishment? How are you looking to influence the establishment and bring them along ultimately, or can one do without it?
Good, good.
Two big questions indeed, so we keep it at that.
I think I should have a go on these.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, what's your name again?
Merab.
Merab Sab. Thanks. I mean, Merab Sab, these are very, very important points that you raise, and I absolutely understand that. You obviously, first of all, you're sitting there, being surrounded by it. So we're discussing your home. But I also say that we have to be empirical on this, and I'm well aware there's a long tradition of the game players, and the game players that you're talking about today are the men who have taken the place of those who sat here and tried to play the same game. And the men who sat here and tried to play that game, they had an exaggerated sense of their own importance and their ability to use the local actors for their purpose. Because clever local actors knew how to talk to the people here and make them, and let them think they were doing their own bidding, while as actually using, Her Majesty or whatever to achieve their own local objectives. And they do the same with Lahore, and they do the same with Zaidan. So that although with respect, there's a tradition of saying, oh, of course, the agencies can replace so and so, whenever they like. It's not that easy. When you study the Taliban, that these are not just people who they only exist because of the bit of money which they're given, or whatever the patronage that they get from the regional actors. They actually have their own standing, their own constituency, their own politics. So in a sense, I sort of feel that this is a conversation that we should have, maybe a blog conversation over time. I really think that you should also have a little look at this what I was talking about, the neglected variable. Taliban politics. It's really worth understanding. I'm not saying that Raiwind and Lahore and Zaidan don't count. What I'm saying is, don't forget this neglected variable. The Taliban have their own politics, which then takes me on to Per's absolutely vital question. And this is but I did say that there are different ways of operationalizing this, and Per has held me on that. Okay, broadly, if you're going to talk about a peace insurgency, is it a peace insurgency which somehow splits the Taliban movement? Simon was hinting that, or could you be talking about that? Or is it something which influences the way that the Taliban movement goes forward? Personally, I believe if the latter could be pulled off, whoever takes this forward, and they're also, maybe it's Per, whoever takes this forward, if they can pull off the empowering insurgents, so that those inside the Taliban movement who have reached the conclusion that this is a war which is no longer worth fighting, and those insurgents can, however they get empowered, show the way, achieve some success. They're all, other peace processes have some lessons for us on this. If they can bring the insurgency with them, then it reduces the prospects of spoiling, and then you start to get the positive benefits of the old Taliban cohesiveness, because then actually, just like as in the old IRA Army Council across the water, when we get people are trying to work out, does it still exist or not? Broadly the consensus of people who followed the peace process in Ireland would reckon that the Army Council has used its authority to rein in dissidents and to ensure a successful peace process over there. If a Taliban establishment could offer the same positive contribution to winding down the conflict, the conflict in Afghanistan, you're in a win-win situation. But again, this whole point about, be careful who you give a veto in going forward on a peace process, it depends on if they actually prove prove willing to do that. So I think the next step has got to be this empowering peace insurgents, get them, empower them to contribute to the dialogue, help them set the atmospherics, help them assert that there is a positive future. And also, and this is very important, this is not a Taliban divide and rule split, let's all go and do obeisance to either the Western powers or Kabul. This is about Taliban, while still Taliban and while still asserting the sense of Taliban cultural identity, saying that, and now we have chosen to move towards a settlement because the movement and the war that we previously signed up for no longer exists. So if you can pull off the insurgents, bring the establishment on board, it's definitely the preferable solution.
Theo, Simon, do you want to add anything?
Not at this stage, no.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Barakat from the Royal College of Defense Studies. Would you mind to share with us how recent have you been conducting this interviews, and what has been the medium of conducting the interviews? Have you seen these people, or have you conducted the interviews first? And then we have also talked about the division among the Taliban faction. We know of at least two major divisions, Mullah Muhammad Mansour and Mullah Abdullah Khandala. Have you talked to both of these groups, and have you seen any different approach between the two groups? And one more question with regard to regional politics. Do you think that ever the issue of Taliban can be resolved without resolving regional issues such as the India-Pakistan problem? Don't you think that there is a connection between the two? Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Theo. I'm Kate Park. I'm from the Afghanistan Analyst Network. We're a think tank based in Kabul. Listening to you speak, I get the impression that this is actually a war that shouldn't be happening. Largely because it's Afghan and Muslims on both sides. But also, if you look at the government side, it's largely the people fighting on the ground are largely poor men from Takhar, Badakhshan, and Nangarhar. The people on the government side who are in leadership positions are also not necessarily sacrificing much, as we see with the Quetta Shura. And ideologically, we can argue about what the different sides are, but it's clear it's not a big ideological battle. It's not like Northern Ireland, for example, we've got very clear political lines. In that sense, then, one of my questions is, why is the war still being fought? And I would want to find out about motivations, economics, who's making money, what's in it for people that means that the leadership on the Taliban side, and particularly some people on the government side, are committed to, not necessarily to fighting, but having to other people fight for them.
Thank you. Should I get another one?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Chris Kalenda from King's College. So Michael and Theo, as I hear your presentation, I hear Taliban leadership. The movement's lost faith in the leadership. Leadership doesn't have control of the movement. There's always been a desire on the part of much of the Afghan government. The U.S. military has often held this view of the defection. So why shouldn't they not believe in the defection model? Why do you believe that, based on what you know, the defection model still is not the right one?
Nice question.
Sure.
Okay.
Theo.
All right. So I'll offer a few comments, and then obviously Michael will follow on. First, on the defection model, I think the problem is that if you go in with the mindset that this is about the defection model, then you create the kind of political climate that's going to cause this to fail. Because it's quite clear from the people that we spoke to that the pro-peace groups, if you like, dissenting groups within the Taliban, pro-peace is one way of putting it, but basically dissenting in terms of the current direction that the campaign is taking, they still have faith in the Tariq. They're not seeking, in a sense, they don't want to be undermining the Taliban movement. This is precisely around saving the Taliban. And so if you go in with this mindset of we're trying to break off groups and cause the Taliban to split, then you're creating a climate for the peace process that's sure to fail, because because these groups are not going to enter into it if it's going to cause a threat to the future of the movement. They're trying to save the movement.
So they're trying to change strategic direction, not seek
Precisely.
protect and seek.
And this goes to the point that they don't have faith in the leadership. And this is where it's possible, as Michael quite correctly points out, that in an ideal world, what you're seeking to do is empower this mid-level cadre who see that the leadership are losing legitimacy within the movement. They don't have a vision of where to go, and if they can define this vision that ends the conflict, brings the Taliban into the political into power in some kind of power sharing arrangement, then the leadership can follow. And this comes back to this point about why is the war happening? Why is it being fought? And in a sense, it goes back to the interviews we did in 2012 with a number of senior Taliban figures, and they already anticipated in 2012 a problem. The problem being that again the view at the time was, the Taliban just have to hang in there, and when the international forces leave, then it'll be a field day for them because they'll have all the cards will be in their hands. And this, to a sense, militarily is true. But what the people we spoke with, again, they appreciated the political challenges it would face of continuing to wage an armed campaign against co-religionists, against fellow Afghans. So back in 2012, the people we were speaking to were anticipating the very problem they now face, which is that this is a conflict that really should not be continuing any longer. And this goes to the point that we make in the paper, which is several interviewees talking about the concern they have that the reason why the conflict continues, we all know, is because there's a political economy on all sides that causes the conflict to continue. And just as this political economy is extensively corrupted the Afghan government, so they fear it's corrupting the Taliban movement. And so, of course, it already has corrupted the movement, and that's why the conflict is continuing.
Yeah, there was a question about the methodology.
On Barakat, on the methodology, the interviews for the study were done 2 months ago. They November. Most of them were done face to face, but those who weren't able to travel, we did them by Skype. We talked with people from both the Akhundzada and official Taliban, and also from the Rasul group. We got high level participation from the Rasul group. To some extent, we could say that even Rasul's representative was quite happy to talk about the need to move to winding down the conflict. You really got to be honest. If I were to characterize their positioning, it was like they were sort of like balancing between saying, "Oh, of course we're true Taliban," but if we're given adequate backing, then of course we can deliver the Taliban into a peace process, which is not actually what we were talking about, but that's what they were very keen to say. So it was sort of like Taliban for hire, prepared to do anything that the backers will ask them. That was the position that they were pushing, which is sort of a little bit like what Marab Saab was talking about, but. We also mentioned in the paper that there's a fairly bombastic Rasul exaggeration of the extent of his influence inside the movement. That was a small group for hire because he didn't control too much of the movement. And on the issue of the regional issues, peace and stability in South Asia, of course, requires addressing some of the fundamental underlying sort of drivers of conflict in South Asia. And I don't think any serious analyst would argue with that. But I would certainly argue, and this comes down to the spirit of look at the neglected variable, Taliban politics, that sometimes when you want to make progress, you do actually have to do some delinking rather than linking. So if, for example, we have to wait for a Kashmir settlement before there could be some progress towards peace in Afghanistan, we've been waiting a very long time for a Kashmir settlement, and I fear it's still quite a long wait. So yes, it is important, of course. Any person who's seriously talking about global security management. Of course, they're going to be looking at those big drivers in South Asia. But I think it is possible to come up with a strategy which delinks some movement on this conflict. That, with the insight that Kate is giving there, what's the point? What's the point of it? I mean, this is a conflict which, in terms of the sense of the diminishing sense of purpose from either side of the conflict, is a conflict which is ripe. Other people, when they look at ripeness, they look in other definitions, but that it has run out of steam in terms of it no longer has a moral purpose. And in somewhere like Afghanistan, you need moral purpose to mobilize your fighters, to persuade people to go and die for you. And this is coming on to Kate's question. I mean, it's absolutely striking. This is one of the reasons why. I mean, I'm both appalled and incensed, and given hope at the same time, because we hear these stories from both sides of the conflict. And one of the most bizarre talks which I actually had in follow-up to this particular piece of study was listening to a credible active Taliban leader who was bemoaning the sons of the poor who were being held prisoner by the Taliban establishment, having been held captive. And he basically says, and so in my life, I've basically got all the tribal elder types who in Afghanistan all do the levying. They all turn up with me and they grab me like this and saying, "What are you doing to get our people out? Because we're one tribe and one country," and so on. And when I talk to the establishment, they've got no good answer. So that this sense that the poor are being asked to sacrifice on both sides, and there's no purpose. This is now palpable, and I think the point is that nobody has yet found a way of, in a sense, harnessing that politically. That's something which is there. I'm confident that our results can be replicated, that any credible researcher who asks these kind of questions in the right way, they will get what Kate is pointing to, and they will find it. And it's big, but it hasn't found a political expression. And that's why we've thrown up this insurgency idea as a way of getting a political expression, but getting the right expression is important, and that's why Chris here is well, I can't accuse this of being disruptive. This is the right question to ask. How is this different from the defection model? Because the Taliban that we've been listening to and we think have the potential for being, in fact, they're not just the people that we're talking to, they are reassuring us that there is a broader constituency of potential peace insurgents inside the Taliban movement. They first of all assert their identity as Taliban, and they're only relevant to a solution if they can continue to do this. And one of the problems with the defection model is that the defection model, the first thing you have to do is salute the other side. And as soon as you do that, you lose all credibility and you lose all influence inside precisely the constituency which is doing the fighting, and it's the wrong approach. So when I would try to talk about, okay, well, what do you mean as a insurgent peacemaker? What's it to be a peacemaker? And for me, the criterion as to who is credible as an insurgent peacemaker is not their willingness immediately to salute the other side, or, for example, to engage into a publicly acknowledged negotiation with the Afghan government. The criterion is their willingness to take practical steps to stop killing Afghans. It's Afghan Kushi. The criterion is that, are you serious about stopping killing Afghans? The other stuff, you can find ways of operating. Just like Per is rightly pointing that there are different ways of operationalizing. The operationalizing of what does an Afghan settlement actually look like, and this whole thing about who concedes the space and so on. These are details that could be worked on. Focus on the simple bits, and the simple bits are that there's no longer any plausible moral cause for shedding Afghan blood. So, are you prepared to stop it?
Just to say, sorry, you'll see when you get a chance to read the paper that there's a fair amount of detail on the methodology and on who we interviewed, and just to emphasise, the people we interviewed were able to reach into and speak for many more parts of the organisation than the RUSI group. I think all parts with the exception of the Haqqanis.
I mean, I'd just like to pick up. I mean, it's a very persuasive presentation, and I think there's a great deal in it. I mean, after all, we haven't had a great deal of success with other methodologies, so I'm very open to this. I'd just like to ask, though, whether this is a bit of a top-down analysis of the Taliban and whether that is actually valid. I mean, it's much easier, I guess, for us to talk to, I mean, it's not easy, but it's easier to talk to Taliban leadership than it is to get a sense of what do the mid-level commanders feel, what do the guys on the battlefield feel. And I suppose the question that I'd be asking is, what does success look like at different levels in the Taliban? I saw an interview a few weeks ago with a FARC insurgent in Colombia, and she was saying, I'm really scared of this peace process because I've always been an insurgent. That's what I am. I've spent my life in battle camps and doing whatever insurgents do. And for me, this idea of integration into civilian life is really scary. Now, would that apply, do you think, to Taliban foot soldiers? I mean, I guess it would vary a lot, perhaps more to the mid-level commanders. They've lost comrades, they've felt for years they were fighting the good cause. Not easy for the leadership to say, you know what, hasn't worked out that well, let's all go home. And of course, it would be a lot more complicated than that. But that's why I think the question of who makes space is I know when you said it was a detail, I know what you meant. I know you didn't mean it was a detail, but it does seem to me that we need some answers to what success looks like and how you can integrate not only the leadership but also some of the commanders in the field as well.
Before you answer, can I get also two other questions so that we finish this one? Yes, question here.
Christina Lamb from the Sunday Times. I'm struggling a bit listening to all this, that I feel like I've heard Simon and his colleagues for years talk about how the Taliban are tired, disillusioned, want to stop fighting. Michael, you've been more on the other side. Why should we really think that this is different, particularly at a time when, as you said, it's rather counterintuitive that on the battlefield they seem to be doing well? And I wonder, a lot of people have said it was a mistake for the Americans to kill Mansour because he was in favour of negotiations, supposedly. I wondered what you thought about that. And also what people you spoke to said about involvement of Daesh, ISIS in Afghanistan, and if that's changing the calculus.
One last question. Yes, sir.
Reading Musica from Asian Affairs. I was wondering, are there any lessons to be learned from the 90s when there was a whole patchwork of regional deals done where they simply stopped fighting in places around Afghanistan? The local Najibullah's commanders just agreed with the Mujahideen to stop fighting, and you had a sort of patchwork of regional ceasefires. Is there any potential for that in this situation?
Yes, Theo, you want to say?
Okay, just a couple of points, and then Michael will have to add more detail. I thought it was interesting on Daesh because we're very focused on their foothold in Nangarhar, and but this is back in November, obviously speaking to them. But some of the folk that we were speaking to were saying they were very worried about the spread of Daesh, but that would be a typical Taliban line, perhaps. But that because some of the analysis has suggested that the Daesh had lost some of its foothold in Nangarhar, but that it was popping up elsewhere, and so it was seen as this concern that the Taliban still had to grapple with. But on the issue, Christina, which is why now, which is a very fair one. The thing that struck me was that we're interviewing 7 people, and they're individual interviews, and they're all saying the same thing, and that's quite striking. And they're coming from different parts of the movement, so it's this consistent message. And I have to confess, I was sceptical because I do military operations. So I'm a professor of war studies previously. And so I was really struck by this. And so it could be, you're right, it could be that we got it wrong and, we weren't interviewing the military commanders who have a real stake in continuing the fight. It's just quite interesting to have so many senior people from different parts of the movement saying the same thing. And when you then connect it with the story, which we didn't get a chance to go into here, but go into in detail in the paper of just how they view the new emir and just how little respect they have for him, it's really striking. You do get a sense of an organisation that's completely feels at sea. You know, they're effectively leaderless because they have no faith in the leadership. Combined with, yes, that we do know that the gains the last 2 years have come at great cost. So, you know, all this picture adds up to saying, yeah, well, why continue the struggle when we're not killing foreigners anymore? We're killing fellow Afghans. And just on regional deals, I mean, I think this is a great question. That was the focus of our talks with some Taliban and government figures in 2013, to see if we could bring them together as an academic exercise and design a ceasefire. It was precise because at that time in 2013, the focus was still on dealing with the top, you know, making a deal with the leadership of the Taliban. And there was no attempt at looking at potentials for conflict de-escalation. And ISAF had no policy on this. ISAF had literally no policy whatsoever, no intention of developing a policy of trying to facilitate conflict de-escalation. And what was very interesting was, I mean, there are a series of examples in the past of local level. These would be district level ceasefires and sub-district level ceasefire agreements. And there are a few examples of this. And so what were the lessons that could be learned and so forth? And what was very interesting, which goes to a previous point that was made about, you know, some insurgents would be very concerned about putting down the weapons and trying to, you know, starting a new livelihood, is how critically imperative it is to bring fighting groups in as part of the local security solution, so that you have, and this is standard fare, of course, for demobilization, but actually to bring them in so they are part of local security commissions that combine government security forces and Taliban. So the short answer is there is potential for local ceasefires, absolutely, that is certainly part of an approach to peace that is less top down, less focused on just the leadership on the Rabawi Shuri.
Michael, yes.
On the issue of what success looks like, I can envisage success with two faces. There's the face which I think is realistically attainable if, powers that be, and they're various, primarily Afghan government, and then it's international supporters that they've got. If they run with this. The first look of success is that the trend in violence levels turns. Success is fewer Afghans being killed, and that's something is going to have to take place over a period of year, 2, 3 years. It's a trend going down, and that in itself creates an expectation that a more complete and rounded peace is also possible. So the next phase of success is actually political agreement, because it's possible to turn the trend in violence without political agreement. So success is declining violence and ultimately a political agreement. And what it looks like for Taliban fighters and for the people that they live with, whether friends or enemies, I would actually think back to an insight that I got from the person from the IRA who announced the final cessation. Shana Walsh had a brilliant insight on that. He said that I thought of myself, first of all, as a political activist, and then the circumstances dictated that I took up arms. In my head, I still had that identity of political activist. So when the time came to say, from 4 p.m. today, all volunteers are ordered to dump arms and devote their energies to the peaceful democratic struggle, for me that wasn't in a sense a renunciation of who I am, that was almost like a return to who I am. And I think that you can transpose that to what happens in Afghanistan. I think the Taliban as a social but not military category will of course continue to be very important in Afghanistan in years to come. But what there won't be is a fighting force operating at the national level trying to overthrow the government. And in terms of, empirically, I mean, are you just having us on? Were you taken in? This is something that we've heard over time. I mean, as somebody who has researched this, and I've tried to be a cautionary, I've been trying to push, always to push in the right direction when I think that, peers are getting it wrong. The things that I have heard from inside the Taliban movement, particularly in this study, but of course, we've triangulated, we've looked, we've done stuff before and and after. I have not heard in the previous years. You get, Taliban veterans who sit down, spend the night together, drinking cups of tea, and the key point in the movement, someone says, the emirate no longer exists. The emirate no longer exists in the sense when emirate means an amir who is guided by God to enforce the Sharia, and whom we are all obliged to obey, that no longer exists. One of the ones that floored me the other day, which is I was speaking to what Kate was asking, again, it's just triangulating after this study, so not reported in this study, was a senior Talib veteran, one of the key figures, who said that anyone who has not by now realized that the Islamic Emirate has become a mafia will not realize it until the Day of Judgment. And these are apocalyptic terms in which Taliban think and speak, but that's profoundly important, because both of those statements, the more casual one, the Emirate no longer exists, and the other one, until the Day of Judgment, you'll be living with this idea that it's gone mafia. Each of them provides the moral and political case for participating in what we're talking about as peace insurgents. Things which they were not prepared to do before this, first of all because it was a threat to their lives, and because also it was a threat to their seat in paradise. You no longer lose your seat in paradise by helping to put an end to killing Afghans and promoting a settlement in Afghanistan.
Simon, any concluding remarks?
No, I think...
Thank you very much. Then, I'm afraid we ran out of time. I know we could stay much longer, and I really apologize to those of you who didn't get a chance to raise their questions. I know that if you read the paper, all your questions will be addressed. So with that said, there is a few copies of the paper printed outside. If you don't manage to get your own, then you will have the paper available online on our website. Before going and rushing out to grab your own copy, please join me in thanking our terrific speakers.